In a cave in northern Spain, scientists cracked open the teeth of a Neanderthal who died around 48,000 years ago. Not to study his diet, to study his dental plaque. The hardened gunk fossilized onto his teeth, and locked inside it, they found something they didn't expect. Traces of a tree, specifically poplar, a close cousin of the willow. And here's why that matters. Poplar and willow both make the same bitter chemical that thousands of years later, humans would turn into the most common painkiller on the planet. This Neanderthal, by the way, had a nasty dental abscess. Now, does a bit of plant DNA prove he was deliberately treating his own pain? No. Honestly, it doesn't. But it's a real clue that the strange relationship between humans and this one bitter tree goes back further than almost any medicine we know. So here's the question this whole video is going to answer. How did a tree's chemical weapon, something it never made for us, become a drug in nearly every medicine cabinet on Earth? And why did it take us roughly 3,500 years to actually understand how it works? Stick around, because the trail runs through ancient Egypt, a curious country priest, a chemical mystery, and one of the quietest credit disputes in the history of science. Let's start with the tree itself, because this is the part most people get backwards. We like to picture willow bark as nature's little gift to humans, a kind remedy just sitting in the forest, waiting. But the willow didn't make this chemical for us. It made it to defend itself. The compound is called salicin, and if you've ever scraped a piece of willow bark and tasted it, please don't. But if you did, you'd notice it's intensely, almost offensively bitter. That bitterness is the entire point. Salicin is part of the tree's chemical armor against insects and grazing animals. It makes the leaves and bark unpleasant to chew, so the very thing that would one day soothe human aches started out as a tree saying, in chemical language, "Don't bite me." And here's the twist that surprises people. When you swallow salicin, your body doesn't have some special willow decoding machinery. There's no ancient adaptation hiding in your DNA, tuned to this one tree. Your gut bacteria and your liver simply treat salicin the way they treat thousands of other plant compounds. They break it down, and in the process, salicin gets converted into a different molecule, salicylic acid. That salicylic acid is the part that actually turns pain and inflammation down. So the willow builds a defense chemical. Your everyday biology accidentally reshapes it into a painkiller, and neither side planned any of it. It's less a gift, and more a lucky chemical coincidence that humans spent thousands of years stumbling into. And stumble we did, for a very long time. The written trail picks up around 3,500 years ago in ancient Egypt, in a medical scroll called the Ebers Papyrus, which appears to recommend willow for swelling and aches. Similar ideas show up elsewhere too. Traditional Chinese medicine used willow and poplar for fevers and pain, and several Native American nations used willow for much the same reasons. Now, you'll often hear that the famous Greek physician Hippocrates prescribed willow bark for pain and fever. It's repeated in nearly every article on this topic, but when historians go back and actually read what Hippocrates wrote, willow barely appears. There's essentially one passing mention, and not as the heroic painkiller everyone claims. It's a perfect example of a fact that got more confident every single time it was retold. But here's the honest part. Most videos quietly skip. Did chewing raw willow bark actually work like popping an aspirin? Probably not reliably. The amount of salicin in bark is low, and it swings wildly from tree to tree. And bark is also packed with harsh, bitter tannins that can upset your stomach long before you'd ever swallow enough to feel real relief. So ancient people likely noticed that willow sometimes helped with certain aches and fevers. What they absolutely did not know was why, or how to get a consistent dose. And that why would stay a mystery for thousands of years. We're about to reach the moment someone finally cracked it open. But quick thing first, if you're enjoying untangling the real story from the myth, go ahead and subscribe, because the next part is where a small-town priest accidentally runs one of the first real drug trials in history, and almost no one remembers his name. That priest was an Englishman named Edward Stone, and the year was 1763. As the story goes, he once tasted willow bark and was struck by how bitter it was. Bitter in a way that reminded him of an expensive imported bark people used at the time to treat fevers. And Stone followed a hunch. A wrong hunch, actually. He believed in an old idea that cures tend to grow near the diseases they treat. And since willows grow in damp, marshy places, exactly where fevers were common, he figured willow might be the cure. The logic was flawed, but the instinct landed. Stone dried willow bark for months, which quietly concentrated the salicin ground it into a powder, and tested it on around 50 people suffering from fevers. It worked well enough that he wrote it all up and sent it to the Royal Society. For the first time, willow wasn't folklore, it was an experiment. From there, the chemists took over. In 1828, a German researcher finally isolated the active ingredient itself and named it salicin, after salix, the Latin word for willow. Within about a decade, others pushed it one step further, transforming salicin into that more potent molecule, salicylic acid. And by 1876, doctors were using it to fight the severe joint inflammation of rheumatic fever. There was just one serious problem. Salicylic acid worked, but it was rough, it was sour, it tasted terrible, and it irritated the stomach badly. People needed the relief, but the cure came with its own kind of misery. So the race was on to build a gentler version. That version arrived in 1897 at a German company called Bayer, where chemists modified salicylic acid into a more tolerable form, acetylsalicylic acid. 2 years later, it hit the market under a name you'd recognize in a heartbeat: aspirin. And here's a detail that trips almost everyone up. The name aspirin doesn't come from willow at all. Part of it comes from a completely different plant, meadowsweet, another natural source of the same family of compounds. So after all of that, the willow didn't even get its name on the bottle. There's also a quieter mystery tucked into this story. For decades, the official version credited a single chemist, Felix Hoffmann, with inventing aspirin. But another Bayer chemist, Arthur Eichengreen, who was Jewish, later claimed that he had actually directed the work, and that his role was erased during the Nazi era. Historians still debate exactly who did what. It's one of those credit disputes that may never be fully settled. But notice something. By this point, humans had been using willow for thousands of years, and we still didn't truly understand why any of it worked. That answer finally arrived in 1971, when a British pharmacologist named John Vane worked out the mechanism. These drugs, he showed, block an enzyme in your body called cyclooxygenase, or CoAX for short, and that enzyme helps produce molecules called prostaglandins. Prostaglandins are part of how your body generates pain, fever, and swelling. Block the enzyme, and you turn that signal down. It was such an important discovery that Vane went on to share a Nobel Prize for it. So sit with that timeline for a second. We use this medicine for thousands of years. We only really explained it about 50 years ago, which brings us all the way back to the bark. Today, you'll find willow bark extract sold as a natural anti-inflammatory, and some endurance athletes and runners reach for it for sore joints and recovery, essentially circling right back to where this whole story began. So does it actually work? The honest answer is somewhat, and with limits. The better studies suggest willow bark extract can help with short-term lower back pain. For arthritis, the evidence is weaker and more mixed. And because salicin only gets converted into the active drug further along inside your body, willow may be a little easier on the stomach than straight aspirin. But, and this part really matters, natural does not mean risk-free. Willow carries many of the same risks as aspirin. It can thin the blood. It can trigger reactions in people allergic to aspirin, and it should never be given to children with viral illnesses. The bark isn't a loophole around the drug. It basically is the drug, just in a slower, messier, less predictable form. So step back and look at the whole arc. A tree evolves a bitter chemical to fend off insects. Our ordinary biology happens to convert that chemical into a painkiller. Ancient people notice it sometimes helps, without ever knowing why. A priest with flawed logic runs an accidental experiment. Chemists refine it. A company renames it after the wrong plant. And only within the last lifetime did we finally understand the machinery underneath it all. So the next time you taste something bitter from a plant and instinctively want to spit it out, remember that one particular bitterness, the willow's ancient warning to insects, is the very same signal humans chased for thousands of years. We just didn't realize we were listening in on a conversation that was never meant for us. And that leaves one question worth sitting with. How many other simple remedies are we still using today without really understanding what they're doing inside us?